I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. We deeply regret that a number of delegations nevertheless decided to apply double standards in discussing the Ukrainian topic in the Security Council of the United Nations. We understand that this is a topic that is not pleasant for you because it does not make it possible for you to justify your charges in Kiev, who are violating the fundamental rights and freedoms of millions of their own citizens. We cannot accept the arguments that we heard that delegations need more time to examine the documents. All these are excuses. The text of the Ukrainian law exists and it's in the public domain since last autumn. The fact that it threatens Ukraine's fulfillment of its obligations under the Minsk agreement is well known. This is why many politicians have already expressed their position on this law, including Mr. Zaneva, who was invited here. That law is specifically under his purview. Furthermore, it has been discussed in other forum. It's very strange for us to hear that the Ukrainian document, supposedly the law was not translated into English. I don't recall similar comments when the Security Council, almost the very next day after the signature by Putin of the law on granting citizenship, was ready to discuss it. Why didn't you criticize the fact that there was no translation to English back then? It seems, what is the connection between language and the Security Council? Whether there's a direct link? We considered it necessary to convene this meeting, or propose to convene this meeting, given that the latest steps by the Verkhovna Rada and the outgoing former President Poroshenko, who's leaving in shame, directly undermines the spirit and letter of the Minsk Agreement and Resolution 2202. The issue of language rights was one of the reasons which led to the Ukraine losing Crimea and Donbass and Lugansk on the 15th of May. Poroshenko once again played a dirty trick on his predecessor by signing into law this text. The Verkhovna Rada approved it a few weeks before that, rejecting most of the amendments which sought to make the law more civilized. The law violates many international obligations of the Ukraine, according to which Ukraine pledges to respect the laws of minorities. This law led to serious concerns by the Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, which during latest elections rejected the previous regime. I just want to recall that almost all citizens of Ukraine understand and speak Russian. According to the most conservative estimates, Russian is the native language for at least 1/3 of Ukrainians, including the former, outgoing, and current president. In spite of all attempts of the authorities of Maidan to try to push Russian out of the public sphere and even private sphere, they didn't manage to do it. This was particularly a sensitive matter for the inhabitants of the south and east of the country, who didn't lose their hope that they could maintain their identity and continue to educate their children in Russian, continue to communicate in Russian, and do their official business. These hopes were clearly expressed during the voting of Ukrainians who lived in these regions in favor of Zelensky, who was not afraid, unlike the outgoing president, to speak Russian. He demonstrated that during today's inauguration ceremony as well.
Floor? Points of order. I would like to give the floor to the Russian delegation to finish his remark and to remind again to council members to consider limiting their statement to the issues of procedural nature. I will give the floor back to the Russian Federation to complete his statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. So President Zelensky demonstrated this during today's inauguration by speaking against attempts to introduce divisions in Ukrainian society based on language. The struggle against Russian and Russian culture and to destroy the close links between Russia and Ukraine became the calling card of the former Kiev regime. The Maidan authorities built their policies on a complete rejection of everything Russian, where they rejected our common origin from ancient Russian roots in Kiev. We were accused of stealing and privatizing Ukrainian history, that Ukrainians and Russians are not brethren people, but very different people, that Ukraine lived for many centuries under the occupation of Muscovy. The Soviet regime was cursed, which I just want to recall, created Ukraine in its current borders. We heard phantasmagoric theories of Ukrainian so-called historians about the origin of the ancient Ukrs, which supposedly originated 45 years ago and are more ancient than the Sumerian, Egyptian, Cretan, Hindu, Hellenic, and other civilizations. We chuckled at this, thinking that we were dealing with borderline individuals. However, today these ideas are official ideology and the doctrine of the Kiev authorities. Hasty decisions and statements by nationalist deputies in the Verkhovna Rada in 2014 provoked centrifugal tendencies in the Crimea, leading to a referendum about its reunification with Russia, and the lack of readiness by the Maidan authorities to ready not to engage in dialogue with the
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Council has had a vote on whether to have a meeting on this subject, and we know the result of that vote. There is not a meeting on this subject. The distinguished representative of the Russian Federation is not giving an explanation of vote. He's giving a substantive intervention on a meeting which is not happening. In so doing, Mr. President, he shows disrespect for this Council, and he shows disrespect for the ruling that you just gave him, asking him to limit his remarks to an explanation of his vote. I would therefore ask you to ensure that the Russian representative follows the rules of this Council and limits his remarks to an explanation of vote and does not give a substantive intervention for a meeting which isn't happening. Thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of the UK. Russia, you would like to have the floor?
Конечно.
Yes, of course, Mr. President. I would like to ask, put a rhetorical question to my British colleague. On which criteria is he judging whether my statement is substantive or an explanation of a vote? I consider it as an explanation of vote, and I am asking you to give me authorization to complete my statement.
You can continue your statement.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you. So, what will the Russian-speaking Ukrainians have to deal with once the new law enters into force? I'll be clear, with the total forced Ukrainization of public life, Russian soon will only be allowed to be used in private conversations, and the special official in charge of enforcing the law will be monitoring this. He will be entrusted in interfering in the work of public and other organizations. A system of draconic responsibilities and liabilities being introduced, including very severe fines. And I want to say that the task of any government and authorities is to, in fact, seek to contribute to cohesion. Meanwhile, what the authorities are doing are introducing an inquisition. They are putting a ticking bomb in Ukrainian society, a neighboring state, and this is very dangerous. Russia considers it essential to draw attention to what is taking place in the Ukraine to the colleagues of the Security Council. The Security Council is a guarantor of the Minsk Agreement and is responsible for the compliance with the agreement by all parties, because what we're talking about is a violation of the right by inhabitants of the two regions for their linguistic self-determination. Just a few months ago, some of you criticized the decision by the Russian president to introduce a simplified procedure for granting citizenship to citizens of those regions, even though this in no way violates the Minsk Agreement. Today, we're seeing a blatant violation of the Minsk Agreement. Furthermore, the new law also undermines other obligations of the Ukrainian side, including economic and social development of the two regions, or punishing certain individuals. But it's also a violation of the Ukrainian constitution itself. One of its articles states that all national minorities have the right to use their own language, or Article 11, which states that the government promotes the development ethnic, religious, and linguistic identity of the peoples of the Ukraine. Article 22, which, according to which, any changes of law should not come at the expense of these liberties, or other articles which state that all citizens have equal rights and are equal under law, including linguistic rights. Also, Article 6 on national minorities is violated, which gives them the right to schooling in their national language. I also have to say that the Ukrainian law, which was not sent for expert assessment by the Venice Commission, does not meet European standards. It would be interesting to ask our Belgian colleagues how you would react if Brussels, for some reason, adopted a decision on banning the use of Flemish or French in your language, and how people would react in Paris or The Hague, or how would our German colleagues react if the German suddenly was banned in Switzerland, or imagine if in Finland Sweden was banned, where 10% of the population speaks Swedish. I'm giving these complete absurd examples so that you really feel the entire degree of disappointment and concern of the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. So what this does is leads to excessive polarization of the people living in Ukraine, and not to mention the fact that a country that claims to aspire to the highest European standards, such steps are unacceptable. So it's against this backdrop, the decision by the citizens of Crimea to rejoin Russia becomes even more understandable, given their wish to use their own language. And by the way, the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar language are also state languages in our country, and they have no the members of those minorities have no danger of using their own languages. So I suggest that we give a proper assessment to this law to prevent further deterioration of the political situation in Ukraine, which creates a true risk of civil confrontation. And lastly, Mr. President, in spite of the fact that we didn't have a full discussion of this topic, we would like to say that we're not particularly disappointed, because by your refusal to discuss this, you once again demonstrated your hypocrisy when dealing with Ukrainian topic. We feel that for your charges, you understood that today's meeting would be unpleasant, and so you spoke clearly in favor of the position of the outgoing Ukrainian government, and that is to sow further discord between two brethren people, the Russians and Ukrainians, and once again confirming that you're not really interested in the Ukrainians at all. You're only interested in your geopolitical agenda and to hit Russia as hard as possible. I want to thank you. Very sincerely for this blatant demonstration of double standards. Thank you very much.
Saying the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.